So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're plugging in. My name is Cristina Liaño, and on behalf of the Global Catholic Climate Movement, I'm thrilled to welcome you to our webinar, Christmas, Consumerism, and Laudato Si. So given this time of year is often a time where we see rampant consumerism, we thought it would be important to offer a space to reflect and look at ways that we're invited to offer a counter witness to what our culture normally does. And so I'm thrilled that we have a fantastic group of speakers who are going to help us in this reflection. And as always, given the nature of our work, I wanted to begin with a prayer on consumerism. So this is written by Jane Doreen. So just take a moment to remember that we're in the presence of God. Creator God, we ask that you move us beyond the poverty of mindless consumption to the abundance of your church's social teachings. We ask that you move us beyond our impoverished need of material things to the richness of solidarity with our brothers and sisters throughout our country and around the world. We ask that you move us beyond the empty drive to store up individual possessions, to recognize the wealth of working for the common good. Grace us to consider the human dignity and the rights as well as needs of everyone in our local, national, and global communities without counting the cost, knowing that as we have read in the recounting of the distribution of the loaves and fishes, there is always enough for everyone to come to the table. We thank you for this abundance. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. So welcome again to our webinar, and we have a wonderful program today. As you can see, we have 3 speakers today. So we're first going to start with Dr. Pablo Canziani of the University of Buenos Aires, who's going to be talking about consumerism and our planet. And then Dr. Juliet Schor of Boston College will share with us a little bit about consumerism, inequality, and sustainability. Finally, Sister Kate Mindling, who's a Sister of Mercy from the Mid-Atlantic region here in the United States, will talk about what's the invitation of Laudato Si. And then we'll have plenty of time for some question and answers. And you'll see at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A box where you'll be able to put in question and answers. And feel free to go ahead while you're listening to the speakers to post questions, and we'll look at those at the end of the program. So to begin, I want to welcome Dr. Pablo Canziani, who holds a faculty in physics at the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina, and is a principal researcher in the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research of Argentina. So he has published many articles on the socio-economic environmental crisis, written from the perspectives of faith and science. And notably, Dr. Canziani was also a lead author in the 4th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which many of you know won the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts in 2007. He is also a member of various working groups, has been a delegation to the Holy See, to the United Nations Convention to Counter Deforestation. But what we're most proud of is that Dr. Canziani is a founding member of the Global Catholic Climate Movement. So with that, I welcome Dr. Pablo Canziani.
Okay, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Speaking to you from the Southern Hemisphere, from a different kind of Christmas, a Christmas in summer, which makes it a very different experience. I've been through both, and it's interesting as well. Really, we have to use the terms correctly. As this talk, this webinar is correctly called, we're talking about consumerism. And we have to be sure that we make a big difference between what we consume as rational people, part of an ecosystem, like the human ecosystem, where we need clothing, where we need housing, where we need food, when we need some goods for our welfare and our well-being. And a different thing is over-consuming, consumerism, hyper-consuming, as it's happening now in some societies. So the overall idea of the presentation I'll make to you is to show the state of the resources, how we're dealing with them currently in the world, and the problems, a few of the problems this is creating. So let me put on screen the brief presentation I have for you today. Okay, so basically many of you will probably have seen this image. This is the energy use, a symbol of the energy use in the world. It's a perpetual night composite image from satellites from NASA, and it shows how the use of electric energy is distributed globally. You will notice two things in the first place. Huge energy use in the US, Canada, Europe, and Japan. China, with the biggest global population, doesn't have such a big energy use, and you will notice as well areas of nil or reduced energy use, for example, in Africa. And this image shows a major issue, the inequality, which Juliet Schor will talk to you later about the use of the access to goods and to welfare. And the other major issue is that we have to remember when we are discussing what we're doing with the natural resources, that globally energy generation remains the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. It's about almost 50% of or more of all emissions with the current way we're producing electric energy. So when we discuss about energy, this proxy image, we have to remember that we're not only using energy for lighting, we're using energy for the production of goods, and the goods that we consume or overconsume or underconsume depending where we live in. So if we look at the last 250 years, more or less, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we will notice a number of things. First, the growth of the global population, thanks to the improvements in medicine, in the quality of living, in the access to energy primarily. And together with that, we see that all the other indicators show the same exponential growth, particularly since the beginning of the 20th century. For example, water use, which is probably one of the most inefficient areas in the world in the use of natural resources. For example, agriculture, which is the biggest and worst user of water, loses about 70% of all the water they have access to through bad practices, through wrong use of water in the irrigation process, through inadequate water distribution networks and so forth. Clearly, we see what happens with the CO2 emissions thanks to the use of cheap energy. Obviously, the number of cars during the 20th century, fertilizer consumption, which jumped during the Green Revolution. But at the same time, we see that the loss of rainforests, particularly tropical rainforests, which are a huge part of the stability of the climate system, have dwindled exponentially as well. Paper consumption, which is a symbol of the most useless consumption we have, about 90% of all paper is lost after one use, and it's not recycled, tells us that we are in a deep problem. Paper comes from pulp, pulp comes from wood, and in many parts of the world, the production of wood and paper from that wood is highly polluting. And it also generates changes in ecosystems and also impacts on the climate system locally or regionally. And then we have the problem, for example, of fisheries. We have the Atlantic Ocean, North Atlantic Ocean has lost all of its fishery production capability over the 20th century. Sometimes we think that we are on the blue planet, the blue-green planet where everything is water. However, if we take a bit of time and we do a very simple calculation, we calculate the surface of the planet Earth with a radius of 6,300 kilometers approximately. and then we consider that all the surface is covered with a layer of water about 3 to 4 kilometers thick, and you convert that to a sphere, that sphere you see on top of Europe is all the water available on the planet Earth. You'd probably be very surprised to realize that there's so little water on Earth. And of all that water, only 1% is clean, unpolluted water or non-salted water. So while water is renewable through the hydrological cycle in the atmosphere, we have to realize that water is a scarce resource, and it's something that is used a lot of in agriculture, which is a primary responsible activity for water pollution in the world, and also in industry, where many industries do not care to purify the water before it's put back to the rivers or to the ocean, be it thermal purification by bringing it back to the temperature of the surrounding hydrological systems, or through the injection of pollutants and back to the rivers. So this is what we're doing. We're using a scarce resource. Mining is another source of major pollution right now, and we're polluting it and ruining it for all future generations. This plot shows you the evolution of the world population, which is probably going to stabilize around 2050 in about 9.5 billion to 10 billion. And what you see on the small picture of the planet Earth in red is what each year human society used up of the renewable resources, like let's say the biological resources, which are renewed every year during the annual cycle. So back in 1985, humanity used up by December 31st all the resources available at that time. So in a way, we can say that humanity is up to then used the interest from our natural banking account. Since then, we have been using more renewable natural resources than what the Earth can produce in a year. So now we're not only using up the interests that we get from the natural system, but we're also using the capital, if you want to put it in economic terms. So basically what's happening is that now, for example, we get every year around September, I think this year was very early in September or in late August, the fact that we've used up all the natural renewable resources of the world by that day. And that also happens, as you will see later, in a framework of huge inequality, global inequality. So if we go on with this economic model, by the year 2050, we will need 2 planet Earths to satisfy the demand on renewable natural resources. So that's really totally impossible. We don't have 2 planets Earth, and thinking that we will conquer Mars as an alternative tells us that we're in a wrong, very wrong frame of mind. We are only going to promote our inefficient model to ruin some other part of our planetary system. If we look at the index that is normally used, the gross world product, you can see it's been growing more or less constantly with a few ups and downs in the last few years due to the crisis since 2008. But on the other hand, we have that the quality, the global living planet index, has decreased by the same percentage. That means that to maintain this gross world product index in permanent growth, we're actually destroying our planet. So in a not so far distant future, we will be in trouble because we won't be able to produce anything more because we have destroyed everything. So for example, this is a problem that we've been discussing a lot in Argentina since the opening of 2 huge mining companies, 2 international mining companies, particularly because these mining companies are operating in the high Andes above 5,000 meters near the major water resources for about 70% of the Argentine territory. Just so that you realize how wrong our images of the world are. Argentina, which is probably one of the biggest food producers, depends on only 30% of its territory with natural water resources, freely accessible, overflowing water resources for the Rio de la Plata basin and great rainfalls. On the other hand, 70% of the Argentine territory is semi-arid or arid and depends on snows and glaciers from the high Andes. Now, mining companies are setting up open air mining right by or on glaciers, and the ring you see below requires the blowing up of 9 tons of rock to produce 2 grams of gold. That is where the gold is now coming in the world. It's processed with cyanide, so it's very polluting. You use millions of liters of water from those glaciers to produce the gold, and most of that gold does not go to useful applications, say, for example, in equipment, electronic equipment, say, for hospitals or for communications. It goes into saving accounts or banks or holes or for jewelry. So that shows you how crazy we are. We're actually blowing up tons of rock. I mean, somebody will say, what's 9 tons of rock in the Andes? It's nothing. Maybe, but it means a lot in terms of water. It means a lot in terms of loss of other productions, which are sustainable. For example, food and fruit production down the rivers from the high Andes. You see the guy there in that comic, that's what we call our, in Spanish, our ecological backpack. We're loading ourselves with a huge ecological backpack, a huge footprint, which is, will impact not only our lifestyle, but also the lifestyle of generations to come. So what have we gained from this? This is a study of the growth of the PBA, the gross national product in the US, and how people feel about it, how they feel about their quality of life in the US. And you will notice that while the personal income at constant dollars has been growing on since the Great Depression in the US, you have a huge problem. Since the 1960s, people are not feeling happier despite the improvement of their incomes. So that is telling us something, and yet people may argue, okay, so how do you find happiness? So it's not a quantifiable issue. So a number of years ago, an economist from the World Bank and a Methodist pastor created what we call the Index for Sustainable Economic Well-Being. What is this? It's an index which uses traditional economic growth factors like GDP, but it also takes into account the costs of maintaining that growth through, say, for example, the impacts on labor, the impacts on pollution, the impacts on quality life of city dwellers, and so forth. It would be a bit like saying that when you have you're running a company, you can not only look at the total gross income of the company, but you also have to look at the expenses you generate in running that company, so that you can discuss if you're an efficient company or if you're actually losing money. So if you look at these indices for a number of countries around the world, first world countries, you will notice that the GDP goes on growing in most places, but after around 1980, 1985, the quality of this more complex index doesn't grow anymore. What is this telling us? That there's a bit like friction when you try to break the barrier of sound. You have to put a lot more of energy, and even if you do that, you will not be able to go faster with your aircraft unless you have a special designed aircraft. So this is basically telling us that we are destroying our society, and we're destroying the environment, because we have to remember both things go together, without any real improvement. Maybe some indices indicate that we have improved, but in general, they always show that around the 1980s, when we started destroying our planet in a big way, we have not improved significantly. So, and to end my talk, this is a study that was published by the Time magazine a few years ago, showing what these families in different countries eat each week. This I bring it to think about what we do for Christmas dinners and New Year Eve dinners. So you will realize that obviously you have two extremes: the German family and the refugees in Chad. The one has excess calories, the other one doesn't have enough calories. And if you look at these pictures closely, you will notice that the family that probably has the best food quality, less packaging, and the better access to sustainable foods is the family in Ecuador, which normally we would not think that they have the top-notch life quality. So with this, I just finished briefly this talk. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Pablo. And the picture is so shocking. I mean, I think we know this in our heads, but to actually see it visibly is really brings it home. So thank you for your presentation. At this point, I'd like to invite Dr. Juliet Schor of Boston College, whose research focuses on consumption, time use, and environmental sustainability. So she's the author of several books, and most recently, Sustainable Lifestyles and the Quest for Plenitude, Case Studies of the New Economy. She's the co-founder of the Center for the New American Dream, a wonderful website which we drew a lot of resources on for our Advent campaign. And she's also the vice chair of the board of the Better Future Project, one of the country's most successful climate activism organizations. So, Dr. Schor, welcome. I think you're muted still.
My apologies. It's a pleasure to be here, and I did want to start by thanking you all for the work that you're doing. And as a non-Christian, I'm especially grateful to the Pope for everything that he's been doing around climate change and ecological, a new ecological way of living on the planet. So thank you, and also, Merry Christmas to you all. The sort of end of Dr. Canziani's talk is a great place for me to begin, because I think if you think about those, before the last slide on food, the diagrams on the relationship between growing incomes, GDPs, and social welfare, and that divergence that we see beginning in the 1970s and 1980s in many places, and also the sort of the flatlining of happiness in the United States. Many people many social scientists would argue, myself among them, that a key component of that divergence is the growth of inequality. And when inequality increases, a whole range of negative outcomes occur. Now, and today, I think, certainly in my country, in more developed countries, richer countries, people are increasingly understanding that inequality is a key problem. And we've had growing inequality for decades now in the United States, particularly in the 21st century. That growth and inequality has really taken on a very vicious form, which is concentration at the very, very top. So if you look at the growth and inequality in the 1980s, it actually began in the 70s, but in the 80s, 90s, it was sort of more and more income to the top 20%. In the most recent period, it's income to the top 1%, income to the top 10th of 1%, to the top 100th of 1%. So it's concentrating really intensively at the very top. And you have similar dynamics, not quite as virulent, going on around the world. So people understand inequality is a growing problem with growing social awareness. So too is ecological overshoot, ecological degradation, and climate destabilization through the warming of the planet, through extreme weather events, through the drying out of the planet, and the whole range of adverse impacts associated with destabilizing the climate. Now, for the most part, we have thought about these as separate problems, although increasingly the climate movement has defined itself as a climate justice movement, so it wants to incorporate issues of inequality. It has done that mainly through arguing, very correctly, the following proposition, which is that the impetus for, the drivers, the causes of climate change and ecological degradation have primarily come from wealthy countries. They are the historical emitters. So if we look at the stock of carbon pollution and other greenhouse gas pollution in the atmosphere, the bulk of it has come from wealthy countries who have used fossil fuels to develop and industrialize over time. So they are the so-called legacy emitters, or the historic emitters. so they bear the burden of major responsibility, and yet the major burden of impacts is in the global south. So the biggest impacts on in terms of desertification, declining food yields, adverse weather events, bigger warming, etc., happen at the poles, among indigenous people in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, etc. So that's one dimension of inequality associated with climate change. I think also more generally with ecological degradation. And that's pretty well understood. Costs and benefits, or responsibilities and harms, very, very unequally distributed. But there's another dimension of inequality and climate change and ecological degradation more generally that hasn't been talked about almost at all, and there's been almost no research on it. But with a number of colleagues, I have started to work on this in recent years. And we got sort of spurred on by an economist named James Boyce from the University of Massachusetts, who first started looking at this question in the context of ecological outcomes more generally. And that is the idea that it's not just that ecological outcomes are unequally distributed so that the poor bear the biggest burdens, whether that's within countries or across the globe. That's, of course, very true. But it's also the case that inequality itself contributes to ecological outcomes, that more unequal societies tend to have worse ecological records, that the more unequal a country is, the more likely it is to be a big polluter or a big emitter of greenhouse gases. And so what we have begun to do in a series of studies is first try and just track this relationship, measure this relationship. Is it true that if a country has more inequality, it's a bigger greenhouse gas emitter? If a country has less inequality, does it tend to emit less? So we're looking across the countries of the world. We're also looking over time. As a country becomes more unequal, does that affect its path of emissions? If it becomes less unequal, does that affect its path of emissions? So we've done a number of studies in which we find this is indeed the case. The more equal a society is, holding all the other things constant, the more greenhouse gases it emits. We're looking at carbon, actually, so the more CO2 it emits, the more unequal it becomes, the more CO2 it emits. So we've done that for rich countries, we've done it for all the countries of the world, we've done it looking at income inequality, and we've now done it looking at wealth inequality just for the wealthy countries, because the wealth data are hard to find. And we've also done it recently for states, looking across at a smaller unit, states in the United States. And what we find is that the more unequal a state, in terms of the distribution of income of its population, the more likely it is, accounting for all the other factors, to be a big emitter. Now, an immediate question is sort of, why is this? What's the mechanism by which this happens? And, excuse me, to explain that, and I should say here we're at a more preliminary stage in our research, but to explain that, it may help to think about different measures, different ways of thinking about inequality. So one of the reasons this finding, I think, has not been it really hasn't been a finding in the literature before our work, for the most part, is the way people were thinking about inequality. So they looked at what's called the Gini coefficient. It's the most commonly used measure of inequality, and it measures the whole distribution of a population and how unequal it is across the whole population. And if you do these, run these models like that, you really don't have much of an impact of inequality. And there are a couple of reasons why. One is that when people go from being poor to middle class, they tend to increase their consumption of fossil fuel energy, which in the data will show up as a more equal society will look like a higher emitter. So it looks like the reverse, and that's pretty much the conventional wisdom among economists. But we looked at income concentration at the very top. So looking at the top 1% or the top 5%, the top 10%, as well as a couple of other similar measures. And when you see that when you look at that kind of inequality, so that concentration at the very top, the results are very different and very strongly support our hypothesis. More inequality means more emissions. Now, we think there are two big reasons why this is happening. One has to do with the fact that as people move up to that very high level of income or wealth, they adopt extremely carbon-intensive lifestyles. And so we can think about the very rich and the way they live multiple homes, very large homes, flying by jet, maybe even private jet. So they have very carbon-intensive ways of living. And we can see this also in some of the wonderful work that's come out of Princeton, looking not at nations and inequality among nations in emissions, but among people within. And so one of the things we know about carbon emissions is that if you take the whole world's population, the bottom half of the population emit almost nothing. They emit about 10% of all the emissions in the world, half the population. So they're really not part of the problem. You look at the very top, and it's a hugely disproportionate amount of emissions coming from a very small number of people. That's also true, by the way, if you look at companies. A small number of companies are responsible for a huge fraction of all the emissions. So, so that's one part of it, carbon-intensive lifestyles. And the second part of it is concentrated economic power leads to concentrated political power. And that political power has been very effective in many countries in forestalling action on climate. And the US is, of course, the most obvious example of this, where the fossil fuel industries and its allies have pretty much bought up the Congress, have prevented action on climate, and you can see it you know, in an exaggerated form right now in the Trump administration, which is coming in as the most anti-environmental group in American history. So political power, hyper-consumerism, or sort of intense carbon-intensive consumerism among the very top, those we think are the two biggest mechanisms that are driving this result of inequality leads to more emissions. And I'll finish up with one sort of political point about this, and that is with domestically, this is less true globally, but domestically, movements for climate and movements to reduce inequality in many, many places have been separated, often because the movements for equality have come out of trade unions and sort of social democratic kinds of forces that are really very focused on jobs and growth. And environmental movements, of course, have had historically a different point of view on that. The more, the kinds of findings that my colleagues and I have suggest that there's a deep structural affinity between these two issues. It's not only a matter of how environmental outcomes happen, but inequality itself causes more climate change. Climate change itself, we know, contributes to inequality. So it's really vital that movements to address these issues come together and address them in a holistic way. And of course, that is very much the message of Laudato Si. I know that's where we're moving next. But I did just want to say it's so important to think about this issue in that holistic rather than segregated way. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. That's so eye-opening. And as you mentioned, it points to Laudato Si and Pope Francis's words, everything is connected. And so the need to really do an integral approach to these issues. So at this point, I'd like to welcome Sister Katie Mindling, who is a member of the Mid-Atlantic community of the Sisters of Mercy and on their Critical Concerns Committee. So for most of her religious life, Sister Katie has taught Catholic high schools and done interpretation translations for the Sisters of Mercy. She's currently teaching Spanish and chairing the language department at St. John's College High School in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Sister Katie.
Thank you very much, and it's really great pleasure for me to be a part of this very beautiful panel. When I heard Dr. Canziani speak of hyper-consumerism, I will tell you that is certainly one of the concerns that we have brought up on our Critical Concerns Committee as members of the Sisters of Mercy, and it's an area of study that we're very deeply and passionate about. And when Juliet spoke of how these are not separate problems, I will tell you that the Sisters of Mercy, in every study that we have done, and looking at 5 or 6 big of our critical concerns, we see the interconnection of each and every one of them. So today I will be happy to share with you some of the things that we did as Sisters of Mercy in our studies of Laudato Si. And hoping I'm coming through okay on the slides. So what we did was to try and study together as a community. There are about 800 of us in the Mid-Atlantic community of the Sisters of Mercy. And we took on the study of Laudato Si, trying to listen to what our Holy Father was saying to all of us in the world and tapping so many people that he brought in. So an informed approach to consumerism. And as Sisters of Mercy then, we did interactions. We read it, we shared with each other our responses. And we really wanted that document not only to inform us, but to call us to transformation. And so we did see this interconnection, and we also had been talking about sustainability and the underlying causes of some of these societal and global issues with which we have been now recently listening to. And so in doing that, we spoke together in small groups. We brought ourselves together in larger groups to try and see how could we respond? How can we ourselves be transformed? And so as a very inspirational dynamic that happened within us, we decided that we would try to do something on a corporate level, that all of us together would agree to adopting a response. And when we examined that, interestingly enough, we all talked about the use of carbon, the use of products that were made through the use of carbon. And all of us really, we see that we're already trying our best to enter into the non-use of plastics, to using getting rid of our use of the plastic bags. So we wanted it to be something more. And that's where we really turned to at making decisions about inner conversion and transformation. We had been, among the other documents that we read in combination with the Laudato Si, was we read The Act of Hope, a book by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone, in which we could see that we can make a difference. And then we also did a study of the Great Turning. And we saw in the script of the Great Turning the invitation to really make changes. And it became something very spiritual for us. So in the course of about a year's time of study and sharing and combining our ideas and suggestions and pooling all of our members to see where we would like to go, we agreed that on one item, we said we would all commit ourselves to do a common examination in the light of prayer about consumerism. And we decided to choose 3 elements in that. And the first one was that we would adopt a common mantra. Now, the mantra in the tradition of many, many religions, but in our own tradition, it is a small, prayerful response that we repeat like a refrain. And we decided we would try to weave that into our lives in whatever way any of the individual members would want to. But even at larger meetings when we would come together and put it, I actually have it on my computer. And in my classroom, what I noticed happened was that very mantra is my screensaver. And so the young people are aware, and so that all those people that we touch, whose lives we touch, will also be drawn into our decision to allow that transformation that happens in looking at what our Holy Father has said. So that was the first prong, the common mantra. And the next was the consciousness examine. And in a consciousness examine, I'll talk a little later about that, we would really ask ourselves bluntly, how are we complicit?
Sister Katie, sorry to interrupt, but we can't see your slides.
Oh, no. I'm not sure how to do it.
To share a screen?
I think maybe, let me try that. Let me try that. Let's see if that works. Thank you for telling me. I was unaware you weren't watching with me.
Perfect.
Is this better? Is this?
Yeah, now we can see it. Great.
All right. I'm sorry about that. Thank you. So you'll see here that this is our common mantra. There were 3 elements that we proposed. And the first was the common mantra. The second is the consciousness examine. And in that consciousness examine, again, I was starting to explain that to you. We really look as honestly as we can at the ways in which we're complicit. And so in order to generate that, those of us on the Critical Concerns Committee have really set out these examines for us and we're all doing it together. So there's a unifying dimension of this. And in the midst of it also, we are helping educate one another about consumerism. And I expect there are many of our sisters here today sharing this webinar, and because we have all tried our best to be well informed on this. So I'm revealing now the mantra that we adopted. And we try to have, in order to have everyone participate in anything at this level, it's so important to involve everyone and seek out everyone's ideas and everyone's energy for this. And so we did, and we sent out and we brought in 13 different suggestions about a mantra, but this is the one that we all are now embracing. You'll find it written everywhere and chanted by us and shared with those people with whom we work, because we believe that the only way change will ever happen will be personal transformation and personal choice making and sharing with others in an attempt to prayerfully stimulate change. It has to change, but it doesn't just change without transformation. That's where we really believe this. So we decided we would have an examination once every 3 months in the course of a year. And we would give the reflection, offer the self-examination. And then at the end of the examination, we raise questions that we hope will help each of us to make changes in our own personal life. And the common effort in this means we never do this by ourselves. We are doing this together. And the great energy that comes from knowing that I am with my sisters wherever I do this, and that we, in our work, in our publications, in our lifestyles, can make an impact and can help promote change. But the hardest change, of course, is right within our own hearts, and we ask that God help us with that. So I thought you might be interested in seeing our very first examine. So the personal needs and wants. And if you take a minute with me, we can look together at this. We first define consumerism as a social and economic order which encourages the acquisition of goods and services in ever-increasing amounts. And you can see how this corroborates with everything we've heard today. And it exemplify the persons who purchase goods and consume in excess of basic needs. Consumerism can mean high levels of consumption and or selfish, frivolous collecting of products, leading to unnecessary surplus and waste. For example, advertising encourages us to want the biggest, latest, and best, the most luxurious, comfortable, and convenient products. We try to bring these questions up to each other and to ourselves. Ideas about luxuries and growing importance of fashion may also be an arbiter for purchasing rather than a necessity to living. Prosperity and social mobility can often provide more disposable income for consumption and may cause ego satisfaction and social stratification of the haves and the have-nots, that less than 1%. And those of us who have we're not in the 1%, but we still have far more than we really need, this is what we're asking ourselves. So these were the two reflection questions, and I guess I encourage everyone listening also to look at these with an eye to seeing how totally honest we would be with ourselves and as a group. Do I in any way live in undue comfort and excess, even though I am aware of the plight of the poor and the vulnerable? And, when Francis speaks of the waste of food and the rising waters that are causing countries to disappear off the planet, it's so important for us to really face those things in prayer. And then in what ways can I release things I no longer need or use and refrain from acquiring more? And we've had conversations within the community of our Mid-Atlantic group, and we hear each other talking about divesting of what we no longer need in a way that it would also go to others who are needy. These are steps that we prayerfully are taking. So of course we encourage everyone to join us in this. And then we do have an educational component, so that in addition to our joining through our own communications and encouraging and supporting each other in reciting the mantra and trying to come to terms with our own desire to divest, we also have a wonderful segment in our group of critical concerns of sisters who are knowledgeable and give us resources, articles, videos, and help us to know the effects of consumerism in our lives. And even now during the holiday season, we just got our latest information segment coming out about gift giving, the possibility of offering gifts of time, skills, and experience. and I'm simplifying. So just sharing that with you. And so throughout the upcoming year, we are going to be doing examines on these next topics of consumerism: a one world economic market, care for creation and environment, and the degrading of human culture. So again, to me, the most important piece of this is that the document, we keep asking for transformation within ourselves, within our members, and in all those areas where we as Sisters of Mercy have extended ourselves through ministry in our world. So I thank you. I hope that this is helping you to see also ways of letting Laudato Si become part of our everyday prayer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sister Katie. That was beautiful, and we love the mantra as something to stay with during the Christmas season, but also beyond. So thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Great. So at this point, we're going to open up the floor for question and answers, and I'm going to go ahead and pose a question that came in early on from David Michael from Abuja, Nigeria. So he asks, at Christmas and other festivities, a lot of food is prepared and about 30% is not eaten. It ends up in the dustbin. The environmental impact of food waste is enormous, contributing to climate change. As a Christian climate advocacy group, and since Christmas is a Christian holy event, what can we do to stop this trend? So stopping the trend of overconsumption of food during the holidays. Would anybody like to respond?
Okay. The issue of food wastage is one of the worst issues right now in the world. The FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization from the UN, has funded a study which shows that normally between 30 and 40% of all food production is lost, either because in wealthy countries it's bought and thrown away, or because poor countries do not have storage technology to put in inadequate conditions that food so it can be saved and used properly. The other issue is that a lot of food is also used for non-dietary issues. And the final issue is that on top of that, because we have in the world 5 companies that manage almost 90% of all seed productions, we are producing unnecessary food. We're not producing a balanced food for a balanced diet globally. We're producing an excess of grains, basically because those seeds have patents and there are agro-toxic packages associated with the production of those foods, that we have a huge distortion right now of the food market. So Christmas just increases the loss of food compared with the daily average loss of food. And that is something that Francis is very much worried about.
Great. Do anybody else want to respond to that question?
This is Julie. I guess I would just say a couple of points. One is in countries like the US, which has very high rates of food wastage, a lot of it is institutional. So there's both the individual household, which is an important part of it, but we also have to work on the institutional side. There are laws that mandate food waste. For example, in my university, if we have a function with food, we are required to throw everything away afterwards. And also just institutional practices. And then I think the other dimension of this is prices. So I spend a lot of time in India, where food is relatively much more expensive than in the US, and the food wastage there, at least at the household level, which is what I can see, is a lot less. In the US, we have very low food prices because they're subsidized through government practices, as well as failure to pay the ecological cost. So the more that we incorporate true cost, the better. Of course, on the other side of that, higher food prices means more food deprivation and so forth for the poor and low income households. So we need a solution to that, which does not get us to sort of more sustainable, less food waste because of a truer cost pricing at the expense of people who can't afford. So it's complicated, but it again, I mean, you see those interconnections.
Great. Thank you. And then we have another question specifically for Dr. Canziani. So, given that both climate science and faith traditions don't recognize national boundaries, what's your take on the complementarity of science and faith to raise awareness about the urgency of the climate crisis? What else can be done in that regard?
Okay, so there are different degrees of boundaries on, if you want, and private boundaries on the different ecosystems and components of the biosphere. The only component of the biosphere that is shared by all and does not have boundaries is the atmosphere and the climate system. So in a sense, that's what makes the climate change issue, as well as the ozone hole issue, ozone depletion, a global problem that needs to be tackled globally. Now, as the Pope said in Laudato Si, the climate system and the atmosphere are the perfect example of a common good, in the sense that it's for everybody and it belongs to nobody. The issue is that if we look at the problems that create environmental destruction and climate change, you will realize that technical and physical solutions are not enough. You need social solutions together with those solutions. And because you have to care, for example, for jobs and for the welfare of people and for health. So in a sense, the only way that you can bring these things together is through ethics and through a religious request for change. People will do things if it's framed in a framework of ethics and in a framework of religion. And as a matter of fact, a few years ago, a book was published asking for religious leaders to generate this environment. And that's one of the things that Francis knew was pedagogy before he went to Rome, that was needed. So I would say that if we do not put everything that society needs to change to deal with this social environmental issue within a framework of ethics and within a framework of theology, be it Christian, Judeo-Christian theology, Muslim theology, Buddhism, and so forth, acting together, we will not have a definite solution to the crisis. We need that ethics and religious framework to implement solutions. Technical solutions are okay, but if we remain with what we call the big fix concept, which means that science and technology can solve everything, then there will not be a solution.
Great. Thank you. So I know we're going a little bit over, and I just wanted to give Dr. Schor an opportunity. She needs to go to a meeting. If you wanted to offer any last words.
Just to say thank you for including me. This has been a really rich discussion. Fantastic presentations by the panelists and great questions from other participants. So I'm sorry I have to rush off, and best wishes for a really joyful and sustainable holiday season to everyone. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for your participation. So Pablo, I know you wanted to show one more slide. And while you pull that up, I just wanted to ask this one final question, which I think is great. So Steve Harrow asks, can anyone advise on how to honor relationships within families, faith communities, etc., when one's feelings on consumerism are not in sync with the general lifestyle of these groups that we are most tied to? So does anybody want to tackle that one? Because I think that's important in terms of we have these values that might not be shared with our loved ones. how do you navigate that? Anybody want to tackle that? Here, Sister Katie, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that we really need to encourage people to, as much as we can. And I think that some of the educational materials where we talk about planning ahead on what we eat, so we're not getting extra food that we then goes bad and has to be thrown out. And I'm not certain, except on one-on-one and doing press releases and trying to get the word out there. I think some people don't have a heart for it and they don't believe in it. And I think that's where it's the most difficult. I don't have any other bright ideas on that.
Yes, it's a tough one, but I think if we speak from the heart, that can often be effective. So, Pablo.
Yes, I think that brings us back to the issue of ethics and religion. I mean, even if you're not a non-believer, if you work the social environmental crisis from the perspective of ethics and of our choices and moral choices, like the Pope says, shopping is a moral choice, a moral decision. We can actually find ways to discuss with non-religious people. As a matter of fact, at least down here in Argentina, we have found more efficient, a larger interest in the non-religious community for Laudato Si than within the religious communities. So I think that's something that we can handle if we go that way. And as my final comment, I was showing this slide. I'm sorry, it's in Spanish. But what I try to do, and this is a slide I've been using for the last 5 years for teaching, is combine environmental and social issues. Squares are the causes of social and environmental problems. Circles or ovals are the consequences. And you will see plenty of arrows and red arrows because I can draw them all. So you have both society as victim and victimizer, and then you have the consequences and the interactions. What this is telling us is that we need urgent action because this is a complex system from the point of view of mathematics. Here, 1 + 1 is never 2. 1 + 1 can be 100. So whatever decision we take to protect society and to protect the environment, we have to be sure that we're not making things worse in another aspect. So that requires the holistic view that we were asking for, the 3 speakers today were asking for today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And I'll thank you, Pablo. And I also wanted to share a response from Marianne Comfort, who's also with the Sisters of Mercy, regarding the last question about how to live out our values amidst other groups with different values. And she suggests modeling how to live with less in a joyful way, that it's not deprivation, but a joyful way of being in relationship and giving more of ourselves than giving things. So I think it reminds me of what Pope Francis says about the perfume of the gospel, that we want to gain people through attraction. So we are at the end of our program, and before I let you go, I just wanted to alert you to what we're planning to do next year in 2017, just alert you to our Mercy to Earth weekend that we're planning, recognizing the convergence of 2 important days, April 22nd, Earth Day, and April 23rd, Mercy Sunday. And we're also drawing upon Pope Francis's amazing message about mercy to the earth that he gave last September. So we have a website up, so you can check that out, mercytoearth.org. It's going to be a global event where we encourage communities around the globe to celebrate and honor and take action to take mercy, to have mercy for our earth. So note those dates in your calendar. So with that, I just want to thank our wonderful speakers, Dr. Pablo Canziani and Sister Katie Mindling. And I know some of you asked about the slides and the webinar, and it will be posted on our webpage. And we'll be sending out an email with all of those links. So you'll have access to that and you can share that. But we just wanted to offer you a very Merry Christmas and gratitude for all of your support and your prayers, as together we work together to care for our common home. So may we truly open our hearts to receive the Christ child in our lives and in our world in the coming days. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day or evening. God bless.
Thank you, everybody. Merry Christmas.
Thanks.
Thank you.